Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that was as shocked this morning as you were. How are you, Rob?
Yeah, you know what, I always sound very well. I can't lie. I'm not, I'm feeling less than well today. Kind of mixed emotions because bad result, but also got a cat today, so that's amazing. So I feel kind of guilty for feeling good about that when the rest of the country, or certain parts of the country, might be feeling very bad. That's my very long introduction. How are you, Tom?
I'm all right. So I mean, we'll get to it very quickly, but the Conservatives won by a significant majority, more so than you predicted. I had gone for the slightly hopeful, maybe it will be a hung parliament based on the polls in our prediction episode. But I think I'm kind of resigned to the fact that I think this isn't like with the Brexit referendum where it was a legitimate shock and I woke up in the morning and went, oh, okay, that's not quite the country I thought I lived in. And in the last election, as we know, like Labour made some gains and ended up with a hung parliament. And we were like, okay, that kind of makes sense. People are angry on both sides. It's about 50-50. And then this today, it's like, yeah, I mean, I suppose I should have seen it coming. I was willing to hope, and we can probably talk about that as we run through stuff. Yeah, I think I've kind of got used to disappointment. One of the things I've been pointing out to people is like, we had 13 years of Labour and we've only had 9 of the Conservatives, including a coalition at this point. So if you were on the other side of the fence and a big fan of the Conservatives, you would be like, well, of course, we deserve another 4 years to equal what Labour had. So, it depends where you are on that. Obviously, I'm disappointed. Maybe the thing that will happen now is that something will happen with Brexit, because with the majority, Boris should just be able to do what he wants.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think you've summed up why he or one of the big reasons why he won there. I think people saw an opportunity to break the deadlock in Parliament. And even on our last episode, we were saying, what are the realistic expectations we've got for this vote? Labour didn't really have a path to a majority. And they haven't. Even in the last election, they didn't. And maybe that's something we'll discuss more later. But the best Labour could hope for in this election was a hung parliament. And I think many people, particularly on the Brexit side, the last thing they wanted was another hung parliament, as Boris Johnson would put it, more dither, more delay. And a result like this enables him to get through whatever he puts before Parliament, pretty much. I don't think he'll have to rely on the ERG like Theresa May did. He won't have to rely on the DUP like Theresa May did. The balancing act is gone. It's Boris's show now.
If you're looking for a silver lining in that, there is the suggestion that because he no longer has to listen to the ERG and DUP, and we'll obviously have to wait and hold our breath and see what happens here, it does mean he can probably just push through his deal as it is, which is softer than a hard Brexit. And I think if he turned up to the EU and said we accept the deal that we have, I think they would say yes. So I think there is a benefit there where, compared to a hard Brexit, which I think we've both said multiple times is not a thing we want. And then we'd have the tick, we have done a Brexit. It's very similar to the withdrawal agreement. I had this discussion at work today. A lot of my colleagues were saddened. I think the majority of my office is Remain and non-Conservative voters. Yeah, we were kind of sat around saying, we're all a bit depressed. It's a bit sad. Kind of expected it, but still, it's real. And then our response that, I was kind of like, well, I suppose something will happen now. I don't know if something will be better than nothing. But as I say, if it does go through with the deal, at least it's better than the hard Brexit alternative that was being shouted about. Boris has already got up and said things like, let the healing begin, etc. And I know I'm not particularly trusting in Boris Johnson, but I think that's the thing I'm clinging to right now, is that hopefully that means we will have some collaboration with the EU going forward. I mean, right now, I don't think we can say necessarily what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think when I was watching the BBC coverage last night, they were saying that the message from EU leaders was fairly positive, because at least they know who to talk to in Parliament now. That, like I said before, it raises the chance of Boris's deal going through. There'll be no more 3-month extensions. They feel it'll be done and dusted by the 31st, and now they can get on with the next stage of negotiations. How that next stage goes and how Boris handles that might be a completely different question. And as you said, you struggle to... issues of trust around Boris Johnson have been raised during this election campaign, and rightly so. But maybe the thing about Boris, if you want to take a silver lining out of this, is this was a man who allegedly sat down at the start of the Brexit referendum campaign, wrote one letter saying why we should remain, one letter why we should leave, and made his choice on that letter. So he's been, he's flip-flopped between the two ideas. He's been quite hard Brexit while he's been on the back benches, but now he doesn't need to listen to the ERG. He could, quite easily flip-flop again and do a soft Brexit to try and, calm the country down and unite everyone. It's a bizarre way that Boris Johnson has led. He is everything to everyone and nothing to everyone at the same time. He, that's part of Boris's, appeal in this election, that he's able to cross traditional party divides. And so he might just change his tune again. Now he's got this big majority. But who, like we say, this is all speculation. Who can say at this stage? But I wouldn't say Boris Johnson is the most hardcore politician. He's quite pragmatic as a politician. He will go where the public takes him, and he might have a look at this victory and have a look at his, the votes that he won in working class areas in the north of the country, and think, right, maybe if I want to keep those voters, I need to provide a softer Brexit than if I was trying to get those in the southeast of the country on side. The parliamentary math is so much different, and the last time we had a majority of this size was the last Labour government that ran from 2005 to 2010. Although Cameron got a small majority in 2015, he still was at the whims of, the hard Brexiteers within the party. That's why we had the referendum in the first place, because he couldn't afford to ignore them and still pass things through the Houses of Parliament. Boris is now in a position where he may get to ignore them. But only time will tell, and I think the big thing for Boris is how that next stage of negotiations after he's agreed to the withdrawal agreement, where he goes from there on the basic trade agreement, and if he can take the rest of the Conservative Party with him.
I think we should probably move on to talking about the results in a bit more depth. I suppose you probably have a few key moments, those Portillo moments you want to bring out. Before we get onto that, I'm just going to throw some maps in the chat, which we'll link. You can find these on the BBC website, so we'll have a link to the full results on the BBC website, but also like the screenshots of them in the notes so that you can see. I think one thing that's really interesting is comparing how this, how the map can be displayed, because if you look at the full results that I'm going to upload now, that's very, very blue. If you look at the country as a normal map. But we also have the cartogram, where they turn make all the constituencies the same size, and then you can understand that actually, there's a lot of red, specifically in cities and in London and in South Wales. There's still a lot of red there. It's very hard to see on the normal scale map how it adds up. If you look at the full map, it very much looks like nearly the entire country is Conservative, but that's because country seats, rural seats that tend to be Conservative voting, are very large in area, because they're supposed to have roughly equal weighting of people between them.
Yeah, I love those maps. Apart from the bit where Scotland looks like it's suddenly got a freaky shrunken voodoo head. Yeah,
I mean, I think some people have described it as looking like Homer Simpson having been in a fight. Various other things I've seen it described as. But yeah, it's a really nice way of showing how data can be both misleading and very accurate at the same time. And this is why you have to think about visualizations and stuff. That's a topic for another time, though. Well, okay, maybe let's start of the night. We had our first seat declared. Was it a shocker?
So the first seat that tried to be declared was Blythe, which had brought in the bloke that used to run the counts in Sunderland to try and make sure that they were the first to declare. Usually a safe Labour seat. However, on this occasion, it was much closer than anyone expected. So they had to say, we're awfully sorry, we've got to do a recount. So then we went up to the normal two up in Sunderland and Newcastle, which both provided Labour wins, but there were big swings in those constituencies. In Newcastle, less so, but in Sunderland, that was a Leave voting constituency, and you might remember from the referendum in 2016 that it was the Sunderland result that sort of sparked the panic that, oh no, this could be a good night for Leave, or a better night for Leave than the polls had expected. There was about a 10% swing away from Labour in a very working class traditional Labour constituency. And if Labour were to, if those results were to be repeated throughout the night, then it would mean a night of heavy losses, particularly in the northwest. Then we get to Blyth, which was the one which said we had the recount in, and that produced the first shock of the night, which was a Conservative win by about, I think it was 712 votes in the end. I was watching it, you had people like Hugh Edwards and Andrew Marr saying, if you'd told me that Blyth was going to go Conservative at the start of this election, my jaw would have hit the floor. And yeah, you just look at the history of that constituency. It's an old mining town. All the demographics should work out for Labour, but it showed how they'd been able to, how there was a real disconnect there between the central party and the traditional roots of the Labour Party. And that was kind of the story of the night. The Conservatives able to pick up seats where they never used to, they were never even considered a serious target. I think they said Blyth was number 72 on the Conservatives target list, so way, way down. Even the Conservatives, I don't think really took it seriously at the start of the campaign. But such was the feeling there against the Labour Party that working class voters changed their mind and switched to the Conservative. Now, the reason why behind that is the big point of discussion. I think we know most of the what demographics switched. The next question is, why? The two main reasons were the one that was said by John McDonnell and the one that's done by the Central Party was, this is a Brexit election. It's because people wanted to get Brexit done, and we weren't clear enough on our Brexit message. These people will come back to us next election once Brexit's over. And I agree with that in part. I think once the Brexit question is off the table, a lot of those people might have a look at what 5 years of Conservative government has done for them, for the NHS, for public services in the area, and might turn around and say, this isn't actually so good. The next problem, though, which the Central Party was less willing to admit, was the effect of Jeremy Corbyn.
Yes, no, understandably. Corbyn has stood up and said he won't be running for the next election, which I think was quite obvious, talking about picking a successor, though not stepping down immediately. It is very interesting how the perception of Corbyn has changed in 2 years, because 2 years ago he was like the new challenger and he got a lot of votes. It's true that he hadn't been drawn on Brexit, so people who were Brexiteers could possibly think he was on their side, and people who were Remainers could possibly think he was on their side, as opposed to having the position they had at this election. But then still, he was new, he was interesting, and he was up against Theresa May, who made several gaffes and just what didn't seem as charismatic as him. So it seems he's just lost all that momentum, no pun intended, this time round.
Yeah, there are reasons behind that. I think people have accused him of being too London centric, and there are a lot within the party that may be criticised their Remain stance or backing of a second referendum, which was what lost them the Northeast, people wanting to drag that on. There are also personal concerns about him. We've talked about the anti-Semitism claims before, and that situation is messy. That was a message that I think clearly got through to the voters and had an influence over this election. It's hard to pinpoint why he wasn't well liked specifically, but you just have to look at the polling data to see statistically he was an unpopular leader amongst the general public, and by quite a few more points than Boris Johnson. That's the fact of the matter. And that's when you go into an election with an unpopular leader where people worry about what he could be like as PM, then that's always going to have an effect on your vote share somehow. So I think that was certainly another factor in the reason that Labour lost so many seats this time round. The other factor which I just wanted to touch on a bit is Labour has a problem where they're losing too many seats in England, and now they're losing too many seats in Wales and the North East to challenge the Conservatives sort of one for one. If Labour want to win a majority, they have to win England. In the past, they used to be able to rely on a lot of votes from Scotland. But now, this election, the SNP got 48 seats in the end. And that was mostly taking seats back from the Conservatives. But they also, I think Labour had 7 seats at the last election in Scotland. Labour now have a solitary MP. If Labour is unable to win in England against the Conservatives, where they're probably at their weakest, and then not win any votes in Scotland and then lose them in Wales, where does a Labour majority come from? If you're, for a voter trying to see how a Labour Party puts their programme into action, it almost relies on the addition of a coalition partner, specifically the SNP. And I imagine that the SNP's quid pro quo for that deal would be, you need to give us a second referendum. That proved to be quite an unpopular proposition for the electorate, especially back in 2015. A lot of people seem to think that that's why when we expected a hung parliament, instead we got a David Cameron majority, because people were scared by the prospect of a possible Labour SNP coalition that would rerun the Scottish independence referendum only a year after it had been done. So I think all of those factors come together and mean that the prospect of voting Labour from a very, very pragmatic point of view, and how you're looking at the electoral math of how they get a majority of the size the Conservatives have, I'm not quite sure how they do that unless they are really able to swing old Blair seats. They need that's the last example I can point to where Labour were consistently able to take seats in England off the Conservatives in areas that Labour would never have dreamt of holding in the past. So again, that might be why their strategy of having a very left-wing manifesto, I thought it's got some great policies, and I hope that they go with another thing. Again, British politics does need a bold approach. However, it's unlikely a manifesto like that is unlikely to win you seats in Labour Conservative marginals, the type that Blair won, because Blair obviously was going with a very different type of politics. So it's a whole mishmash of problems for the Labour Party there, and it's hard to pick at one and say why it did so bad. As always, I think it's probably the perfect storm of problems for the Labour Party that meant it had one of its worst nights since 1984.
I think my personal take is that I feel Brexit definitely was a big part of this. I don't know what the switch was for people who went. So there were people who voted Brexit last time round. We had slightly more turnout overall at the last election, by 4%, I think it was. There were people who voted Brexit who still voted for Labour, and though that has changed to produce these effects. Because if you look at the percentages, Labour's lost 7.9%. It's interesting how that compares, because you'd say, for the Conservatives to do this well, you would just think the Conservatives would have gained significantly. But overall, the Conservatives only gained just over 1%. In fact, that on purely percentage terms, the biggest winners last night were the Lib Dems, who got 4.2% extra votes. So the Liberal Democrats didn't have a particularly good night in terms of seats, because they won 3 new seats but lost 4, including their leader's seat. So they ended up with a net loss of 1. But percentage-wise, they've done pretty well. The Brexit Party took more votes than the Conservatives. Obviously they didn't exist last time round, so 0 to 2% is not a massive game. But still, the main point is that Labour consistently lost and everyone else gained a bit of those votes. And it wasn't just they all voted Brexit. It's interesting that tactical voting doesn't seem to have played much of a part. based on those percentages?
I mean, I think tactical voting, people tried it, but it's not as effective as just having one party, the Conservatives, standing for Brexit. You know, the move that Nigel Farage did and the Brexit Party not standing in those seats really did help shore up their support. And it makes, if people simply don't turn out or don't vote at all, and it makes them look great. Going back to your point about Labour, what's changed between 2017 and 2019, what I would say, if I was living in the Northwest and somebody told me that Labour still supports getting Brexit done, to borrow Boris Johnson's phrase there, I think I could look at the evidence and say, yeah, Labour have voted in Parliament for every step of Theresa May's plan to, the Brexit process back then. They were still supporting it. However, when her final deal came to the table, it failed because Labour and the Lib Dems and the SNP and everybody else voted against it, as well as some Conservatives. And even right at the end, although some members of the ERG dug their heels in, you had people like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg supporting Theresa May's final Brexit deal. So I think a lot in the Northwest could point to the Labour Party and say, you're the reason for this dither and delay over Brexit. You're the cause of this. And I'm going to punish you at the ballot box for it. They punished them once at the council elections and again at the Europeans. This was the final blow. So that would be my point on where things have changed on Brexit in particular.
And it does seem like there's been a shift even from those European elections. So I think that's the thing where if people were surprised, it's maybe because they were looking at the European elections and going, well, things were roughly what we expected. Whereas here, things have gone outside. I mean, they were still within the realm of what we could have expected from that, the polling data going into the election. But I still think people are surprised. There was a lot of stuff where there was quite marginal wins for Labour last time. So that made them more open to losing constituencies because, if you won a marginal by a few hundred votes last time. It is interesting where seats have consistently changed. Places like Canterbury that are now, that's the second time it's been Labour. So I think there are still things like student votes there that are having an effect.
Yeah, the voters, I think we all live in our little bubbles, don't we? And this election is sort of a warning of not looking at the last election and thinking it'll be like last time. Because I remember last time it being like, I was quite doom and gloom last time thinking, Theresa May's going to romp this, even though she's had a rubbish campaign. The polls just say that she will. And suddenly out of nowhere, Labour had a night where everything went right for them. And last night they had exactly the opposite. But on Twitter, an hour before, I was being told by people that Dominic Raab's seat was up for grabs. Ian Duncan-Smith's seat was up for grabs. Uxbridge, yeah, there was that big rumour on Twitter that went around saying, Boris Johnson's in Uxbridge. Everybody, get out and vote. We can, the Conservatives might win, but the Prime Minister, Boris won't be PM. It
would have been fun. That would have been a very interesting silver lining to have, to be in that position.
But that just didn't materialise. Again, you could say that the Lib Dem vote collapsed in Uxbridge as people attempted to tactical vote, but the Lib Dems still picked up 2,500, which is enough to, mean that campaign isn't successful. So, Labour it's not all doom and gloom for Labour, is what I would like to say.
No, I mean, people are saying, it's the death of Labour. And I'm like, well, people said that about the Conservatives in 1997. Parties come back, but it takes time for them to change.
Precisely. And what Jeremy Corbyn has done for the Labour Party, he's been able to motivate and activate a force within the country. I've got people who weren't politically active at all amongst my generation voting Labour for the first time ever, or feeling like now's their time to make a difference. Now, results like this can be a real body blow, and you kind of think, particularly when you've lived in that bubble, you think, but I knew nobody in my friend's circle who voted Conservative. How could this happen? There's a world outside, social media, and clearly the Conservatives have got a good grasp on that world. Traditional media and those sort of channels still work, but there is hope for Labour in the future, that they've got a very young, very energised base. It might take 5, it might take 10 years, but I think that once those people used to say that, you get more conservative as you get older, that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment.
I mean, I think there's a very good John Oliver thing where they have like loads of American presenters quoting that famous quote. But I mean, it's just not true. I mean, the number of academics I know, professors who are all Labour voters. My main problem with that quote, though, is that the idea that as you get cleverer and as you get wiser and older, you choose Conservatives, which I don't think is true. I think there's a lot of very clever people who vote Labour, Lib Dem, Green. So I think that's my point on that. I think that's the thing that I have most issue with. I'm sure there is a trend in some place where people tend to get more conservative as they get older. And also as people tend to have more stuff, they are less likely to take political risks because it will affect all the big pile of gold they've built up over their lifetime. I think one thing I've noticed is, so I know there are some people who are definitely conservatives out of my Facebook friend list. None of those people made a single post about the election on Facebook. And they do use Facebook. I mean, some of them don't use it as much as I do, but there are definitely people who use Facebook. So I think that's a big difference. And it's like the silent majority thing we discussed during Brexit. You see that. I have seen, a large number of Labour memes attacking the Conservatives on my Facebook page, and some of the comments that appear under those are really bad. And you do see the occasional person like fighting with someone in the comments a bit more, but I think there definitely is, like, people realize if they come out with certain opinions in a certain bubble on Facebook, they will get pushbacks. They just don't. So I think that's one of the ways the bubble works with social media. I still think, I mean, I was saying this in a chat I was having last night, that I've tried to think, like, I know there are some people who are like, if you voted Conservative, get off my Facebook, all that kind of stuff. And I understand where those people are coming from. I am in a position of privilege where I'm not judged for the colour of my skin and many other things. I mean, basically, white man who's British, I appreciate there's a lot of privilege there. But there are... I've tried to widen my bubble because I feel I can see those people on Facebook and see what they're thinking would be fine. And I definitely know I have some friends on Facebook who would vote Conservative. They're not people I hang out with very often, but I've seen that. I've had discussions at parties with people like that. We disagree, but normally they've been quite amicable, which is fine. And then going wider again, I know I have colleagues not in the office I'm normally in, but in some of the other offices who are more likely to vote Conservative. And I thought I'd had some good conversations with people like that, where it kind of went, you start with the opening discussion of what, we're both fed up that we've just been talking about Brexit for 3 years after the referendum. And then you open a conversation from there. It's quite an interesting way to see how people think. And I thought I'd got a general impression those people had mellowed in their views, at least the ones I talked to. So obviously I haven't widened my bubble enough to encounter these people who are like strong Brexiteers, regardless of what's happened in the last few years. Possibly all this talk that we've had, we said, don't say all Brexiteers are stupid, all that kind of stuff that was in the news. Possibly that stuff has just galvanised them even more. Not that this is 100% on Brexit. There are some people who just voted Conservative because they voted Conservative. But I think that there is room for me to widen my bubble and get more opinions from people than I thought. I thought I'd done a good job of it, and clearly I hadn't, because I would have still predicted this to be nearer to a hung parliament.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, like, social media in particular, maybe it's just my timeline and how it goes, but it was trending yesterday. Like the stuff trending yesterday was Labour fight back, all of that jazz, that they were going to do it. And so when you get such a strong disconnect between what you feel the reality is and then when reality bites, it means people are going to have very strong opinions on the matter, and not lash out, but I was saying how well Corbyn had done to get a lot of people motivated about it, and speak their political views, but you do create this other class of people who become very shy. You talk about shy conservatives. That's like a known political thing that people don't tend to go about saying that they are conservative, but they use their power at the ballot box and get what they want. And it appears that the British voter is, I'd say the British voter is surprisingly pragmatic. And maybe we as political commentators, or the way political parties infer what a result means, might be very different from what a voter intended. So there'll be some people today who'll say that, oh my goodness, like this country has voted for Boris Johnson, who is a racist and a bigot and all of that, and this country is racist to its core. I don't believe that for 1 second, personally, and I know that the vast majority of Conservatives out there would not share that opinion. They voted for Boris Johnson because they wanted to get Brexit done, and they kind of held their nose at the other stuff, and don't consider that, much like how those on the Remain side and tactical voting, who may have had problems with what the Liberal Democrats had done in the past or what Jeremy Corbyn had done. I saw a lot of that on social media saying, I'm going to hold my nose and vote tactically this election so the Conservatives don't get in, because they were trying to be more practical. They would say, that people are struggling and saying, I don't agree with everything this person or this party stands for, but I've got to make a choice. The danger there is that the Conservatives double down on this and say, oh, great, the country has voted for a super duper hard Brexit and we should be really racist all the time. Like, I feel if the Conservatives do that, then they won't win at the next election, that those working class seats that voted with them last time that voted for them in this election will turn on them and say, no, that's not what we wanted at all. And that's why you get big backlashes. And again, that's why I said at the start of this, like, it's dangerous to think about what happened in 2017 and say it's definitely going to apply to 2019. Because, you can say 2017 that, the Labour, one of the big takeaways of that was that everybody thought Corbyn was unpopular. Actually, he's far more popular than we all thought. And aren't these left-wing policies amazing that he's put forward, this radical new manifesto? So they did kind of double down on that. They did a really big nationalisation program in that manifesto, and they did a lot of other policies that, I think kind of went further than 2017. Maybe that wasn't the reason people voted for them in 2017. It's so hard to, it's so hard to say with any certainty, but there's a plethora of reasons people vote for a party at a given moment without wedding themselves to it for life. And that's what we have to remember at every general election. That's why a political landscape can change so much it changed a lot between 2017 and 2019, and even between like 2015 and 2010, like it's changed a massive amount, and you are seeing that redrawing of where, of people who we thought would never vote Conservative in their lifetime have switched in this general election, and that's probably because of a culmination of stuff emanating from Brexit and beyond.
I think it is, as you said, it's why a voter votes is for a lot of reasons. I think it is very easy to forget that. I mean, obviously, as I say, there are some people who always vote the same way regardless, but we've done a lot of discussion of policies, looking at manifestos. When you've been doing that for weeks and weeks up to the election, you form a very clear picture in your mind of who you're going to vote for. And I am constantly surprised, and I should stop being surprised, because I have spoken to people who are like, well, I went in and I was going to do this, but I got there and I changed my mind because X. Whatever that reason is, I think to people who are doing a lot of following of politics, it seems very different from our perspective. Like, unless something massive came out on the day of the election that was credible and proved, like, say suddenly some documents were released that were like, oh, we've proven Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite and all of this, then suddenly I think that would change those people's views. But otherwise, I think people who are reading up ahead of time are less likely to suddenly change their vote, like in the polling booth. But it's interesting, people can change based on stuff they've heard that day. It's multiple reasons, and people try and take a single narrative from it, and that can be problematic. I had two things I wanted to mention before we moved on to maybe asking for some audience questions. The first thing was your point about traditional media. So we have rules in place whereby the BBC, etc., cannot discuss what's going on election day. They have to, we get dogs at polling stations and things like that because they cannot talk about what's going on outside of a very limited range of things. That doesn't control Doesn't affect social media, so obviously people can share what they like on social media, and brands can as well. But also the newspapers are not controlled by that on election day. And a friend of mine shared a photo where I think it was a rack of 12 newspapers, of which 9 or 10 had anti-Corbyn / pro Johnson front pages, headlines, and then all 3 of the pro Corbyn papers were on the bottom shelf. And that's in London. That's not in a particularly staunchly right-wing seat. The fact that those 3 of them are on the bottom shelf may just be where they end up all the time. I don't think that's necessarily the thing to dwell on. The thing is that you've got 3/4 of those print publications on the day going one way. And I think, personally, I think that's a bit problematic. I definitely think the rhetoric in places like The Sun and the Daily Mail is damaging. A lot of the stuff, we've touched on that before, especially stuff like when you had the Supreme Court making rulings on Brexit and they started to say they were traitors and stuff like that. That kind of stuff I don't believe should be allowed at all. That's just not okay.
Yeah, I don't know if those tabloids are going to tone back their language now they've got the result that they wanted, but it was a particularly tumultuous 2 years there, I think, with some pretty horrible headlines.
Briefly, again, it's a thing of bubbles. I would never buy The Sun. I don't want to give them my money. I wouldn't go on their website if I can avoid it. But having seen it out and about a few times, I've read through it a few times, and I've just been I can't believe this publication still exists. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about when you think you're in a book. There are still people working for an institution that produces that in this country. It doesn't take that many people to be reading it to have it, it will affect their opinions if that's their source of news. So yeah, not a massive fan of The Sun, as I think you've guessed.
Yeah, no, I think after 2017, we thought that the newspapers had lost some of their effect over the electorate because you had a rise in Corbyn despite so many broadsheets and tabloids being against him. I think maybe part of the reason was that the personal attacks on Corbyn that they did were not hitting with people. It didn't ring true. You've got to have something based in truth for it to stick with people, or you'll just have people openly laughing at your newspaper, which was kind of what was happening back in 2017. This time around, it appeared that the newspaper appeared to be following the national mood rather than trying to set the tone. So there will always be a debate about how much newspapers, in particular The Sun, influenced the election. I believe The Sun has backed the winner in every general election back to at least major. I know from 1992 to now, The Sun has always said that they're backing the eventual winner. However, that's usually because The Sun looks at the polls and then makes up its mind. No, it doesn't work the other way around. It doesn't. It's usually The Sun following public opinion rather than them influencing public opinion. Yeah, there's still a big discussion to have about that. But yeah, like you said, that is its own bubble in itself. And social media is how people like the Labour Party have tried to get around that. When they're getting bad press in the newspapers, they try and give them good press on Twitter and Facebook, and that seems to have been very effective amongst younger voters, but there's still a large majority of the population who rely on traditional media, and that seems to have swayed a large number of them this time around. If it carries on being a factor, if it's more of a factor or less of a factor in 5 years' time, we'll have to wait and see. And
the other thing I want to touch on is we mentioned earlier that, a lot of coverage was saying, it was a terrible night for the Lib Dems. And I think, obviously, losing your leader's seat is not great. The margin that Jo Swinson had and then lost by is not massive. Obviously, it's a shift. She lost her seat. She's also had to step down because, she didn't do as well as she'd hoped. We're talking about someone who, at the start of the election, was saying, I'm a credible contender for the Prime Minister. And I know most of us did not believe that at the time. But, that was how the rhetoric started. The polls were very strong for the Lib Dems at the start of this process. And then they've ended up losing one seat overall. I'm glad that they got Richmond, which is near us, and got rid of Zach Goldsmith, because I'm not a fan of Zach Goldsmith. But it's being described, well, at least some of the coverage I heard, they're saying, it was a terrible night for the Lib Dems. And I'm like, I don't really think, personally, losing just one seat is absolutely atrocious. I think they hope to do better. There are a lot of places like Chuckerham and split the vote with Labour, and then you've got Conservative coming in there. So there are definitely problems like that they faced. But if you look at the percentages, Lib Dems actually got the biggest boost in percentage over the country. So that the point I want to make really is, we've touched on this before about proportional representation. I've done a very simple calculation where I've taken the percentage of the vote and used that to directly relate to seats, which I don't think is how any of the proposed proportional voting systems would actually work. Though, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I mean, it's the simplest way to do the calculation. If this percent went straight to seats and you rounded up or down, how would it work? Based on that, the Conservatives would have had 283 seats. They'd have still been in the lead. Labour would have had 208. The Lib Dems would have had 75, which is 7 times what they've got. SNP would have had 25. Obviously, that's a bit weird because SNP only stands in Scotland, so, take that with a pinch of salt. Greens would have had 18, which is significantly more than their 1. And the Brexit Party would have had 13, which is obviously significantly more than their 0. So that's an example of how things could happen with a proportional system as opposed to first past the post.
Sorry, and that way you would have got a Rainbow Remain coalition, wouldn't you?
Yes.
If you'd gone down those lines.
Some people would say, oh, well, if you have proportional representation, then you get the Brexit Party in. I personally think that had we had proportional representation by the time Brexit became to be a tenable discussion, I think things would have been different if we'd had Brexit Party MPs in Parliament who were in a small group of them causing a fuss back then. I think it would have forced us to face some of these issues earlier. And I don't think we'd have ended up with the decision Cameron made and all those other decisions that led to us having the referendum we had. I think if they'd have had a regular presence in the chamber, people probably wouldn't have decided to have a 50-50 vote on it. I think there would have been more thought in the referendum. It wouldn't have just been like, oh, well, of course we'll win. So I think, that there is a benefit to having those people represented. If their voice was being heard in that way, maybe they'd have made different decisions as well. I just wanted to raise the point that first past the post is still a terrible system.
It's rubbish. So much of this election was about tactical voting, and tactical voting would have gone out the window in a PR system. First past the post is, we've been saying it for election after election, and pretty much since 2010, every election then it's reared its head with people saying, look, it would have had a very significant impact on the outcome and makeup of Parliament. In 2015, you would have seen a massive UKIP representation there, but equally in 2010, you would have had a very significant Lib Dem presence there. And it stops you having to make up your mind. I talk about my constituency as an example of tactical voting gone wrong. It's standing against Jacob Rees-Mogg. Obviously, you could vote Lib Dem or Labour. Lib Dems put a leaflet through my door every other day. I thought, they're probably, they're going for it, but the tactical vote site still said, vote Labour. So which ones do you choose? It seems to be pretty low down Labour's hit list of ones, so, you try and weigh up your options. And in the end, I think, even though the Lib Dems came third, both Labour and the Lib Dems got around about 13,000 votes each, where Jacob Rees-Mogg got 27, 28. So if you add the Labour and the Lib Dem votes up, it might have been very close against the Conservatives. However, that's a perfect split, isn't it? That's 50-50 down the middle, people who are probably all Remainers, not able to make up their minds who is the best person to stand against Jacob Rees-Mogg, and that's the really frustrating thing. You shouldn't have to do that bit of calculation in your head. You should vote for who you really believe in the policies of, and see that reflected in a national parliament. But I don't see the Conservatives wanting to change that anytime soon, given the fact that they've got an 86 majority out of the current system, and the other way they probably would have been the opposition to the Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add there. I think I've made my point on proportional representation. If people want to check my maths, they can, but I think that's roughly right. If, as I say, taking into account that I was literally doing a percentage straight to seats, which probably is not how any system would have actually worked. But yeah, still, it's an interesting thought experiment. Okay, so thank you again for joining us as always. Thank you, Rob, for coming and giving us those insights. As always, you can find us at parliamentary.observer, our website. You can find us on YouTube, where you can watch the old videos with like a nice audiogram thing that I've got set up. You can find us on Instagram at Unpile Podcast, as well as on Twitter. You can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. And you can also find us on patreon.com/TTSS, where you can support all of the shows made by Tinker Tailor Soldier Sponge Productions, which is mostly me and a copy of Ferrite podcast recording studio. And some Discord, but yes, no, yeah, you can find us there. You can throw some money our way, or you can get emails every time we release an episode. There's bonus content for patrons. We're trying to roll out slightly more of that. The main thing is news from Unparliamentary Language, but I'm thinking of doing some outtake episodes and stuff like that over the Christmas break that will be exclusive to patrons. So, fun stuff coming your way if you throw us a few dollars or currency of your choice. I don't think it has to be exclusively in dollars. I think the other thing we wanted to touch on, I think we mentioned this 2 episodes ago, didn't we, Rob, that we're going to be meeting up in person over the Christmas break, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion then about the format of the show. So if you have any suggestions at all, feel free to contact us. You can get us at the email unparliamentary@tinkertailorsoldiersponge.com, or you can contact me if you know me personally, comment on the Facebook page, send a message to the Facebook page. All of these ways of getting to us, comment on Reddit, comment on the website, ideas you have for the format, or things you like. We want to know what it is we're doing right, and if there's things we can tweak. I know when we started off, we had like silly games and stuff every episode, and those were maybe a bit hard to do, but maybe we could bring those back occasionally and stuff like that. So any ideas you have, feel free to send them our way. We're going to have a bit of a think about the structure of the show, length. Also, if you have opinions on how long a podcast should be, please throw them our way. And yeah, I think there might also be another... Well, my plan is, I don't know about you, Rob, but I was hoping we could do our predictions episode for the next year again, which I think that went down pretty well. But this time with tacking on the where did we go right, where did we go wrong from last year. So I think we've got homework before we meet up to both re-listen to that episode and see how wrong we were.
I cannot remember what I said last year. I would be interested to listen to that. Maybe I'll have to go back and listen to myself and go, oh, goodness me.
I do remember being contacted about halfway through the year. Someone saying it's been pretty spot on so far. I don't think we predicted a December general election. I think we did discuss the possibility of a general election this year, but I think we mostly said that was unlikely. But how the turntables. But yes, no, I'm looking forward to seeing you in person and discussing that then. I'll bring down a microphone and we can have a chat. And on that note, it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him.
Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.